what really happened in a medieval battle. Not the movie version, the real one. No slow motion sword fights, no perfect armor, no heroic music. Just the truth as it was. If you've ever been curious about what it was actually like, it's time to find out. For starters, if you were an average soldier, you probably couldn't even hear the signal to attack. The guy with the horn, he was usually somewhere safe, far from the actual fighting. Smart move on his part. Medieval horn players had the highest life expectancy in the army, right behind the kings who started the wars. In the first 15 seconds of battle, nearly half the front line would trip on their own feet or their comrades. Medieval battlefields weren't neat parade grounds. They were muddy fields with hidden roots waiting to send you face first into the dirt. Nothing says fearsome warrior quite like falling on your face while screaming, "Ah, my ankle." You didn't charge like heroes in stories. You shuffled forward in a nervous mass, your knees weak from standing in formation for hours. The man next to you breathed heavily, stinking of garlic and fear. Medieval breath mints weren't a thing which might explain why soldiers yelled so much. It was the only way to breathe without smelling your battle buddy's lunch. Everyone shouted, but nobody could tell you exactly what they were yelling. Most men just screamed to push down their terror. Studies show that in combat, about 70% of men make involuntary noises they don't even remember afterward. If you could translate most medieval battle cries, they'd probably come out to something like, "Mom, help. I regret everything." Then came the first hit. Someone slammed into your shield. Your ears rang, but you couldn't tell if it was from the blow or from the man who just headbutted you. The noise was deafening. Not heroic battle music, but a wall of grunt screams and metal striking metal or flesh. Your arm vibrated so hard from blocking that hit. Your grandchildren would be born with the shakes. 2 minutes in your grand battle plan was reduced to one simple goal: stay upright. Falling meant death from the weight of other men stepping on you. The ground became slick with blood and vomit. Your arms ached from holding up your shield. The sun beat down, cooking you inside your padded gambeson. Medieval armor, the world's least comfortable portable sauna. The only weight loss program where you might lose 15 libs of sweat or your head, whichever comes first. Your world shrank to the few feet around you. You just saw the terrified eyes of the man opposite you, who was just as confused as you were. In that moment, you both silently agreed that whoever told you the battle was glorious deserved a special place in hell. And all this was just the beginning. If you survived the initial clash, you'd face the next brutal reality of battle. Real medieval combat looked more like a violent rugby scrum than a fencing match. Fighters didn't square off one-on-one. They ganged up whenever possible. 5 against 1 was considered good strategy, not poor sportsmanship. Knights didn't follow a code of honor in battle. They followed the "I want to go home alive" code, which trumped everything else. The crush of bodies made proper sword technique nearly impossible. You had about 6 in of space to move your weapon. You couldn't do those big dramatic sword arcs when pressed shoulder to shoulder with your fellow soldiers. Most sword fights involved awkwardly jabbing your blade forward like you were trying to poke someone on a crowded subway car. Swords were rarely the killing blow anyway. According to Battlefield Grave Analysis, most fatal wounds came from downward strikes to the top of the skull or neck. Exactly what would happen when someone fell and others piled on. Medieval battle strategy was less defeat your opponent fairly, and more kick him when he's down. Then kick him again, then maybe once more for luck. The pommel of your sword, that heavy metal knob at the end of the handle, often proved more useful than the blade. Sword experts call this half-swording or murder stroke technique, where you'd hold the blade and swing the handle like a hammer. This technique was called the murder stroke, which is probably the most honest name for any fighting move in history. Helmets saved lives but created new problems. They limited vision to a narrow slit and turned your head into a metal oven under the sun. After just 20 minutes of fighting, the temperature inside a medieval helmet could reach over 100 degrees. Many fighters died not from wounds, but from heat exhaustion. Medieval knights basically fought inside portable saunas while people tried to kill them, making them either the bravest or most foolish humans in history. If you fell during this chaos, you had about 2 seconds to get up. Not because of some rule, but because that's how long it took for boots to start trampling you, or weapons to find gaps in your armor. Examination of medieval battle sites shows that many bodies were found face down in just inches of mud. Not dramatic death, just slow suffocation after falling. Wounds often came from unexpected angles. Your armor might stop a sword from the front, but what about the guy hitting you from behind? Or the side A, typical fighter received attacks from at least 3 different directions within any 1 minute period. Your head would spin, trying to track all the threats, which is ironic since keeping your head from literally spinning off was the main goal. The crushing trampling and disorientation took more lives than straight-up combat skills. If by some miracle you survived this chaotic dogpile with all your limbs still attached, your next challenge would be dealing with whatever weapons came flying at you. The weapons of medieval battles weren't the gleaming masterpieces you see in museum displays. Most were rough tools designed for one purpose, breaking through whatever stood between you and your enemy's soft parts. Let's talk axes first. Battle axes weren't fancy. They were basically the same tool used for chopping wood, just modified to chop through shields armor and, unfortunately, human bone. They had a major advantage. You didn't need much training to use one effectively. Swing hard aim, somewhat close to your target, and physics did the rest. The downside, once your axe bit into something, be it a wooden shield or someone's ribcage, it often got stuck. Medieval battlefield findings show that many axe wielders died while trying to yank their weapon free. An axe getting stuck in your enemy was the medieval equivalent of your phone dying at 99% battery. Frustrating and potentially deadly. Spears were the most common weapon on medieval battlefields, with some armies using them for up to 70% of their forces. Why they were cheap to make and required minimal training. A simple wooden shaft with a metal point could be mass-produced easily even by smaller kingdoms with limited resources. The real benefit was reach. You could stab someone from 6 FT away while they were still trying to get close enough to hit you. The drawback was maneuverability. In tight formations, spears became more hazard than help. Battlefield records mentioned numerous accidental spear injuries to allies. Many medieval soldiers got poked more often by their friends' spears than by their enemies. A painful lesson in watching your back, in the most literal sense. Maces solved a problem that swords couldn't. Plate armor. As metal armor improved, slashing at it became useless. The solution? Stop cutting and start crushing. A mace was essentially a heavy metal ball on a stick designed to dent armor, inward breaking bones without needing to cut through metal. Simple, effective, and terrifying. Church records from the period show that many religious knights favored maces because they technically didn't shed blood and thus didn't violate religious restrictions. Medieval logic at its finest. I can't cut you open, but I can turn your insides into pudding. God's totally fine with that. Swords get all the glory in stories, but they were actually the least common weapon on medieval battlefields. Why they were expensive? Really expensive. A good sword could cost as much as a small house. They required special steel-skilled craftsmen and years of training to use effectively. Only nobles and professional soldiers typically carried them. And contrary to movie magic, swords broke frequently. Analysis of battlefield swords shows that many had been repaired multiple times before their final use. Nothing ruins your heroic moment quite like your fancy sword snapping in half on the first swing, leaving you holding what amounts to a very expensive metal stick. Then there were the improvised weapons, the desperate solutions of peasant armies and last resort fighters. Farm tools repurposed for war were remarkably common. Flails, grain threshing tools, pitchforks, and even sharpened shovels appeared regularly on medieval battlefields. Records from several major battles indicate up to 20% of common soldiers fought with modified farming equipment. These makeshift weapons often proved surprisingly effective, mainly because no one expected to be defeated by a gardening tool. Death by shovel wasn't glorious, but it was just as final as death by sword and considerably more embarrassing to explain in the afterlife. The craftsmanship of weapons varied wildly, too. While kings and nobles wielded masterfully crafted pieces, most ordinary soldiers used mass-reduced arms of questionable quality. Rust, loose handles, and improperly tempered metal were common problems. Many weapons failed during use, leaving their owners scrambling for alternatives. As these crude weapons found their targets, medieval fighters quickly learned that armor didn't make them invincible, just slower when trying to escape. And the wounds these brutal tools left behind? They opened the door to a whole new level of battlefield horror. All those weapons we just talked about, they weren't designed to look cool. They were designed to tear through human bodies. And tear they did. Armor helped, but not as much as you'd think. Chainmail could stop a slashing sword once, maybe twice. But a direct hit from an axe or mace that mail would fold right into your flesh, turning your protection into part of the wound. Records from battlefield surgeons indicate that about 40% of armored knight casualties had shattered bones, despite their armor being intact. Armor was basically medieval bubble wrap. It could handle the first drop, but anything after that was just making crunchy noises as you broke. A hit to the shoulder might take the whole arm with it. Medieval weapons didn't make clean cuts. They tore shredded and mangled. Most fighters who lost limbs in battle didn't die from the injury itself, but from blood loss, or the infection that followed. Blood loss happened far faster than in movies where heroes fight on despite multiple wounds. The human body contains roughly 10 pints of blood, and losing just 2 can cause unconsciousness. Records suggest that many soldiers bled out in under 5 minutes after major wounds. Sometimes you didn't even know you were hit until your vision blurred and your knees gave out. Internal injuries from blunt weapons were actually worse than cuts. Nothing to stitch up, just pain and panic. A solid mace hit might not break the skin, but could rupture organs, crack ribs, or cause brain bleeding. Medieval doctors had a technical term for these hidden injuries, the "oh no, he was fine a minute ago" syndrome. Not every wound was dramatic. Teeth flew out when helmets took hits. Eyes got gouged by splinters from broken shields. Small wounds that today would need just a few stitches became life-threatening due to infection. Records from monastery hospitals show that for every soldier who died in battle, 3 more died afterward from wound infections. There were no medics waiting on the sidelines. The closest thing to battlefield medicine was other soldiers tying belts around wounded limbs to slow bleeding or cauterizing wounds with heated dagger tips. Medieval pain scales ranged from "I can still fight" to "please just kill me now," with very little in between. Field hospitals, when they existed at all, were usually just tents where the wounded were laid out on straw. Surgical tools weren't sterilized. They were maybe wiped on a cloth if you were lucky. Battlefield surgery success rates hovered around 30%, and most procedures involved amputation, not because it was always necessary, but because it was quick. The mental trauma from these wounds often proved as devastating as the physical damage. Many survivors described feeling their minds fragment during battle, especially after seeing or experiencing horrific injuries. And as the battle wore on, your mind would begin to play tricks on you. The medieval battlefield wasn't just a test of physical strength. It was a mental nightmare that few were prepared for. As the battle raged on, something strange happened to fighters' minds. Something that training couldn't prevent and that bravery couldn't overcome. Where am I? This question haunted many fighters after just 10 minutes of combat. The constant movement, the spinning to face threats from all sides, and the lack of clear sightlines meant that many soldiers quickly lost their sense of direction. Without modern communication systems, units became separated and disorganized. Studies of battle accounts reveal that approximately 60% of medieval soldiers couldn't identify which direction they were facing after the initial clash. This explains why some battles ended with both sides accidentally retreating from each other. The world's most deadly game of you go first. Is that guy with me or against me? Recognizing friend from foe became nearly impossible once the fighting started in earnest. While armies often wore identifying colors or symbols, these quickly became covered in mudblood and dust. In the panic of battle, soldiers sometimes struck down their own allies by mistake. Records from the Battle of Talton in 1461 show that as many as 1 in 10 casualties may have come from friendly forces with hundreds or thousands of fighters swirling around the battlefield. Split-second decisions often had deadly consequences. Is this my blood? A terrifying moment came when you noticed you were covered in blood but couldn't tell if it was yours, your enemies, or your friends. Blood splatter from nearby kills could cover you head to toe, making it impossible to know if you were wounded without taking time to check. Time you didn't have when someone was trying to bash your head in. Many fighters describe the surreal experience of being drenched in blood, yet unharmed, while others didn't notice serious wounds until they felt light-aided from blood loss. Do I swing now or just keep ducking? Combat decisions became almost automatic as the battle wore on. The conscious mind couldn't process information quickly enough to make thoughtful choices. Instead, fighters relied on muscle memory and instinct. Training exercises drilled into soldiers over and over again would take over. Like a dance routine your body remembers even when your mind goes blank. Those who survived battles often reported having no memory of specific actions they took. Their bodies fought while their minds went elsewhere. It's like when you drive home and suddenly realize you don't remember the last 10 minutes of the trip, except instead of missing a turn, you might have stabbed 7 people. The human brain simply wasn't designed to handle the stress of medieval combat. Fear, rage, and confusion took turns driving behavior with little room for strategic thinking. Modern studies of how the brain processes extreme stress show that higher cognitive functions shut down under threat, leaving only the most basic survival instincts active. For medieval fighters, this meant their carefully planned battle tactics often gave way to primal responses within minutes. You'd start swinging at shapes rather than people, as exhaustion and stress-mounted vision could narrow to a tunnel. Instead of seeing whole people, fighters began to react only to movement and basic shapes. A flash of metal, a blur of color, something coming from the left. Friend or foe became irrelevant in the state. If it moved toward you, you struck at it. Records from medieval battle survivors consistently mention this odd detachment, where other humans stopped looking like humans and became just threats or obstacles. After enough minutes of this sensory overload, the body would move on its own while thoughts became just white noise. Modern combat psychologists call this battle mind, a state where action precedes conscious thought. In this altered state, fighters reported feeling disconnected from their bodies, as if watching themselves fight from a distance. Time stretched or compressed, with some soldiers recalling minutes of combat that witnesses said lasted hours, or hours that passed in what felt like moments. This mental disorientation made battle even more chaotic than it already was. And when it became too much to bear, many chose the one option that actually made perfect sense. History books glorify last stands. Movies show heroic soldiers fighting to the death. The reality, most medieval soldiers had a more sensible approach. When things got bad, they ran. Battlefield records show that about 40% of medieval armies would flee before combat reached its peak. This wasn't seen as shameful by ordinary soldiers. The shame came from nobles and knights with reputations to protect. Peasant fighters followed the "I'd like to see my family again" principle. Medieval foot soldiers had a saying, "The graveyard is full of heroes, the tavern is full of runners." Battles often ended because one side panicked first. Once a few people started running, it created a chain reaction. The Battle of Hastings featured several moments where Saxon forces broke rank, regrouped, and returned before the final outcome. Many fighters would play dead fake injuries or beg for mercy when cornered. Some hid behind horses or wagons. One French soldier survived by crawling inside a dead horse for hours. Not exactly the heroic tale you'd tell your grandchildren. Running away had its own dangers. Comrades might cut you down for deserting, and in heavy armor, running any distance was exhausting. Many knights were caught simply because they ran out of breath after 100 yards. Those who did successfully escape often found that victory wasn't about glory. It was much simpler than that. When we think of victory in war movies, we see cheering soldiers waving flags and heroic speeches. Medieval reality, far less Instagram-worthy. If you were still standing when the dust settled, congratulations, you won. That was pretty much the only victory criteria. No elaborate ceremony, no medals, just the profound relief of not being dead yet. It was basically the world's deadliest game of musical chairs. When the fighting stopped, whoever was still standing got the prize of continued existence. No dramatic cheering erupted when battles ended. Most survivors were too exhausted, injured, or traumatized to celebrate. Battlefields after fighting were eerily quiet places, with fighters simply sitting down where they stood, too drained to speak. The typical victory cheer wasn't hara, but more like, "Thank God that's over. Does anyone have water? And maybe a new pair of pants that don't have someone else's blood on them." The immediate aftermath focused on practical matters. You wiped blood off your face, hopefully not yours, and checked for wounds you hadn't noticed. You looked for your friends and collected usable weapons from the ground. Medieval post-battle checklists were simple. Arms still attached. Legs still work. Friends, some missing. Enemies, more missing. Overall, a good day. The field became a grim marketplace after battle. Valuable armor was stripped from the dead regardless of which side they fought for. Even boots were taken from corpses if they looked better than yours. Medieval recycling programs were way ahead of their time. Nothing went to waste, especially if it was shiny or still had a good edge. You celebrated by drinking whatever alcohol was available to dull both physical and mental pain. One English chronicler noted after a major battle that the men drank for 3 days without pause, as if trying to drown what they had seen in cups of ale. Medieval victory parties were less "we are the champions" and more "please help me forget everything" through the magic of fermentation. Medical tents became crowded with the wounded. Field hospitals had mortality rates between 25 and 50%. Medieval hospital waiting rooms had just 2 categories: might live and probably won't. Your category largely depended on whether the surgeon had gotten enough sleep the night before. The physical aftermath lingered for days. Bruises appeared where you didn't remember being hit. Sleep came with difficulty, interrupted by sudden movements to block attacks that weren't there. Nothing says successful warrior quite like punching the air in your sleep and accidentally giving your spouse a black eye while fighting an enemy who died 3 years ago. And somewhere in the mud, a broken helmet sat crooked on a stick. Medieval battlefields were rarely cleaned. They simply grew over with occasional bits of metal working their way to the surface centuries later. What movies call victory was really just the beginning of a different kind of struggle. One fought not against enemies, but against pain loss and the knowledge of what humans could do to each other when ordered to buy destinum. Part 2. How medieval castles defended against invaders. Ever think about how a bunch of stone walls held off whole armies for years? Medieval castles weren't just big homes. They were battle-ready machines built to beat the odds. Their power wasn't just in how strong they were, it was in how smart they were. And it all started with one question: where to build the castle? These builders chose high ground whenever possible, hills, cliffs, and rocky outcrops, forcing attackers to fight gravities before they even reach the walls. The ultimate medieval workout plan: climb a steep hill in a full armor while people throw rocks at you. At Edinburgh Castle in Scotland, attackers had to trudge up a steep volcanic rock that left them exhausted before battle even began. Water features provided instant protection on multiple sides. Castles on peninsulas or islands like Bodiam Castle, with its massive surrounding moat, created barriers that siege equipment couldn't cross. Approach routes were deliberately made narrow, winding, and exposed, forcing attacking armies to march in thin, vulnerable lines. Some castles only had a single approach path, while others sat above drop-offs that eliminated entire attack angles. Weather worked as a defensive ally too. Winter winds would blast exposed routes, and spring rains turned dirt paths into mud pits. Nothing ruins a good siege like discovering your heavy siege tower is slowly sinking into 6 in of mud. At Carrigsonend Castle, frequent rain made the steep limestone cliff nearly impossible to climb safely. The natural terrain also served as a psychological weapon. Imagine marching for days only to arrive at a castle perched on an impossibly steep cliff, or surrounded by treacherous marshland. Many attacking forces lost their nerve before a single arrow was fired. Records show that some sieges were abandoned simply because the attacking army couldn't figure out how to overcome the natural obstacles. Forests were preserved around castles to restrict the movement of siege weapons and provide cover for defenders to launch counterattacks. Castle builders sometimes engineered the landscape, creating artificial ponds or clearing specific areas to eliminate cover for approaching enemies. These natural defenses were just the beginning of a castle security system. Once attackers managed to reach the actual structure, they would face the next challenge. Once attackers reached a castle after battling natural defenses, they faced walls specifically designed to withstand nearly anything. Medieval castle walls weren't just big. They were engineering marvels built to absorb punishment. The sheer size would shock most modern visitors. Many castle walls stood 20 ft thick, about the length of a school bus. Do castles' walls measure nearly 21 ft at their thickest? Medieval contractors never had to worry about their clients complaining, "I said thick walls, not that thick." This massive thickness served a practical purpose in absorbing energy from battering rams and other siege weapons. Medieval wall construction followed a clever sandwich approach. Workers built two parallel stone faces and filled the space between with smaller stones, broken rubble, and mortar. This rubble core created walls both immensely strong and somewhat flexible, able to absorb impacts without cracking. Many featured a sloped base called a talus that deflected attacks upward instead of straight into the wall, making battering rams less effective. It also created a troublesome angle for siege ladders. Medieval architects discovered that slippery slope wasn't just a logical fallacy, it was a great defense strategy. Sophisticated castles featured concentric walls, an outer wall, and a taller inner wall. This meant even if attackers breached the first wall, they'd find themselves trapped in a killing zone between walls with defenders shooting from both sides. Talk about being caught between a rock and a hard place, literally. Some builders incorporated small pebbles into sections, where enemy sappers might try to tunnel under walls. These loose materials would shift and make noise when disturbed, alerting guards to digging activities. Medieval alarm systems. No batteries required, just physics and gravel. While these mighty walls could withstand tremendous punishment, resourceful attackers developed specialized weapons to overcome them. But even the most formidable siege equipment often found its match in the castle's next line of defense. Gatehouses weren't doors, they were mousetraps, but the mice wore armor. The gatehouse represented both the weakest point in castle defenses and, paradoxically often, the strongest. Medieval engineers transformed what could have been a vulnerability into one of history's most ingenious death traps. A typical gatehouse consisted of multiple barriers. First came a drawbridge over the moat. Behind this weighted, heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron, but the true danger lay just beyond. The most crucial defensive element was the portcullis, a heavy wooden or iron grate that could be dropped from above. Many advanced gatehouses featured two portcullises spaced about 20 ft apart. Medieval architects invented the world's first crush zones long before car manufacturers thought of them. Except these were designed to crush people, not absorb impact. The ceiling contained murder holes, openings through which defenders could drop rocks, boiling water, or burning pitch onto trapped attackers. Nothing says unwelcome guest quite like a hot oil shower from above. Some murder holes at major castles measure over a foot wide, allowing for particularly unpleasant surprises. Arrow loops line the walls, allowing archers to fire from protected positions. These narrow slits gave defenders a wide field of fire while presenting the smallest possible target. Medieval arrow slits the original "I can see you, but you can't see me" technology. The entire gatehouse is usually projected outward from the main walls, creating a three-sided kill box. This arrangement allowed defenders to rain down destruction from above and both sides simultaneously. The gatehouse at Bovis Castle extends nearly 40 ft beyond the main walls, creating a gauntlet. Few attackers survived. Some castle designers added devious psychological elements like sharp turns that disoriented attackers and prevented battering rams from building momentum. Medieval equivalent of "you can't get there from here" was literally built into the architecture. The most cunning trick was the false gate, a convincing-looking entrance designed to draw attackers into an even more heavily defended area. Medieval catfishing, when that attractive entrance turns out to be a deadly trap. While the gatehouse represented a formidable ground-level defense, a castle's full defensive potential couldn't be realized without utilizing its most obvious advantage. Height offered a crucial advantage in warfare, and medieval castle builders used this principle to devastating effect. The tops of castle walls and towers were sophisticated weapons platforms designed to rain death upon attackers. The castle walls' most recognizable feature crenellations weren't just decorative. The raised sections or Merlin protected defenders, while gaps or embracers allowed them to shoot arrows or throw projectiles. Medieval architects understood social distancing centuries early. Stay behind the stone and shoot through the gaps. Behind these ran the wall walk, a pathway where defenders could move quickly around the perimeter. These were wide enough for two armored men to pass without anyone awkwardly falling off. Shooting from above gave defenders a significant edge. Longbowmen could eerie arrows from 200 yards away, while crossbowmen handled closer targets with armor-piercing bolts. Some towers featured arrow slits arranged to create overlapping fields of fire. Heavier weapons included springs, large crossbow-like devices hurling darts powerful enough to skewer multiple attackers. Nothing brings enemies together quite like being pinned by the same giant dart. Simple physics made for the most terrifying weapons. Heavy rocks dropped from heights of 30 to 60 feet crushed shields helmets and the people underneath. A 20 B rock dropped from 40 FT hits with the force of a horse kick. Defenders heated sand or water contrary to popular belief. Oil was too expensive for regular use to pour through machiculations. Stone projections with floor gaps. Hot sand would get under armor, causing excruciating burns, while boiling water could scald attackers to death. While these elevated defenses made direct assaults nearly suicidal, determined attackers often tried to bypass walls entirely. This led castle designers to develop yet another critical defense. Approaching a medieval castle wasn't as simple as walking up to the front door. Between attackers and those stone walls typically lay a massive ditch, the moat, creating a serious problem for invading armies. Just when you thought attacking a castle couldn't get worse, now you need swimming lessons. Most moats measured between 10 to 30 ft wide and 5 to 10 ft deep. While water-filled moats were common, they weren't just about drowning enemies. They prevented tunneling underneath walls, a technique called sapping, as the water table would flood any attempted tunnels. They also forced attackers to build bridges or use boats, both dangerous options when arrows are raining down. Dry mows worked effectively too. These deep trenches could contain sharpened stakes, metal spikes called caltrops, or, in warmer regions, even dangerous animals. Nothing says go away quite like a ditch full of snakes. Some castle builders took psychological warfare to new levels by filling mows with sewage and rotting garbage. The smell alone might make attackers reconsider their plans. Crossing these barriers required portable bridges or massive filling operations, where soldiers would dump dirt and timber into sections of the moat, all while being targeted from above. Drawbridges added another clever defense layer. Operated by counterweight systems or chains hidden inside the gatehouse, they could be raised quickly to create an impassable gap. Some advanced castles featured multiple drawbridges in sequence, creating several obstacles to overcome. Interestingly, archaeologists examining Bodiam Castle found its impressive-looking moat was actually quite shallow in many places, suggesting it was designed partly for show. Medieval lords understood that sometimes looking tough was half the battle. While mows excelled at slowing ground attacks and complemented the wall defenses we discussed earlier, any invaders who managed to cross these watery death traps would next face an even greater challenge. Medieval castle towers weren't just impressive stone structures. They were sophisticated battle stations that controlled the entire defensive system. Rising up to 100 FT tall towers gave defenders the ultimate advantage of height and visibility. First and foremost, the towers served as early warning systems. Lookouts stationed at the top could spot approaching armies days before arrival, using smoke signals, fire beacons, or flag systems to alert the castle. The Tour de Constance in France featured a special chamber for signal fires visible 20 meters away. Those medieval lookouts were like human traffic cameras, except instead of speeding tickets, they handed out arrows. Tower design evolved significantly over time. Early square towers had a serious flaw: blind spots at corners where attackers could work unseen. By the 12th century, round or D-shaped towers became standard, eliminating blind spots and making it nearly impossible for battering rams to find flat surfaces to strike. These curved walls also deflected projectiles better than flat surfaces. Strategic placement was crucial. Towers were typically spaced 100 to 200 feet apart, the effective range of a long bow, ensuring overlapping fields of fire where attackers would face arrows from multiple directions simultaneously. Try dodging arrows from multiple directions while climbing a ladder. It's the medieval version of a very unfair video game. Inside, castle designers created specialized fighting platforms with arrow loops, narrow slits, that allowed defenders to shoot while remaining protected. These openings were cleverly splayed inward, giving archers wide visibility while presenting tiny targets to enemies outside. Towers connected to wall walks, allowing defenders to move quickly between positions. Many featured spiral staircases curving clockwise, a small but brilliant detail that gave defenders coming down the advantage while hindering right-handed attackers climbing up. With these towering advantages secured, castle defenders still needed one more crucial element to withstand long sieges. Once the gate slammed shut and the drawbridge raised, a medieval castle transformed from a fortress into a self-contained community. The real challenge wasn't just keeping enemies out, it was keeping everyone inside alive. The original lockdown had nothing to do with pandemics and everything to do with not getting murdered. Food storage formed the backbone of siege survival. Castle designers built massive underground storerooms called undercraftofts, specifically to hold enough provisions for months of isolation. These cool, dry spaces preserved grain beans and dried fruits, staples that could last through long sieges. Barrels of salted fish, smoked meats, and hard cheeses lined the walls. Most castles maintained food stores to last at least 3 to 6 months, with some prepared for a full year of isolation. Dew Castle in England had storage capacity for a garrison of 100 men to survive for nearly a year. Medieval meal prep wasn't about Instagram photos. It was about not starving while arrows flew overhead. Water supply proved even more critical than food. No matter how thick your walls, thirst would defeat you within days without access to clean water. Castle builders solved this problem by digging deep wells directly into the bedrock beneath the central courtyard or keep. Some of these wells reached astounding depths. The well at Ke Chevalier in Syria plunges 120 feet down. Other castles collected rainwater in massive cisterns that could hold thousands of gallons. The smartest castle designers built their wells before constructing anything else, ensuring workers had water during the years-long building process. Nothing ruins your day quite like spending 5 years building impenetrable walls, then realizing nobody thought about drinking water. Daily life during a siege took place in cramped, uncomfortable conditions. The castle population swelled beyond its normal size as peasants from surrounding land sought protection behind its walls. Space became precious. Great halls that normally hosted feasts transformed into communal sleeping areas. Privacy vanished. Noble families who typically enjoyed private chambers might share space with dozens of others. Medieval castle Wi-Fi would have had serious bandwidth issues, except the only thing streaming was the occasional leak in the roof. Sanitation presented another major challenge. Castle designers built latrines that emptied through chutes in the outer walls, a simple but effective system during normal times. During sieges, however, these became vulnerable points that enemies could climb or use to start fires. Alternative arrangements included chamber pots emptied into dedicated waste pits in the courtyard. Some larger castles featured sophisticated systems. Pembroke Castle in Wales had a massive latrine tower that could accommodate 20 people simultaneously. Medieval architects understood, no matter how fancy your castle, everybody poops. Health concerns mounted as sieges dragged on. Fresh vegetables quickly ran out, raising the risk of scurvy and other deficiency diseases. Doctors stored herbs and medicines, but their effectiveness was limited by medieval medical knowledge. Castle inhabitants relied heavily on brewing beer and wine, not just for morale, but because the fermentation process made these drinks safer than potentially contaminated water. Beer keeping medieval defenders both hydrated and slightly more optimistic about being surrounded by enemies since 1066. The psychological impact of Saj life cannot be overstated. Boredom, fear, and claustrophobia affected everyone trapped inside. To combat this castle, life continued with structure and routine. Guards maintained regular watches. Craftspeople continued essential work, and religious services provided comfort and time markers. Games like chess dice and backgammon helped pass the endless hours of waiting. Being trapped in a castle during siege was like the world's worst vacation. Terrible accommodations, limited menu, and the neighbors keep trying to kill you. While the towering defenses we discussed earlier kept attackers at bay, sometimes castle inhabitants needed ways to slip in and out undetected. The most important doors in medieval castles were often the ones nobody could see. Behind massive walls and towers lurk networks of hidden passageways, concealed doors, and secret tunnels that served as both emergency exits and strategic advantages. The original emergency exits didn't have those annoying alarms, but they did occasionally have snakes. Secret escape tunnels known as bastions or sallyports allowed defenders to slip out undetected during sieges. These narrow passages typically emerged far from the main castle in wooded areas or ravines. The castle features a famous example, a 200T tunnel through solid chalk cliffs that wasn't rediscovered until 1794. These weren't just emergency exits. They were medieval versions of ghosting an unwanted party guest. These hidden routes enabled defensive raids. Small groups could sneak out at night to sabotage enemy siege equipment or attack sentries. Records from the 1216 siege of Dover Castle described defenders using sallyports for nighttime attacks that destroyed enemy catapults. Most of these exits had multiple sharp turns to prevent enemies from rushing in if they discovered the passage. Some castle tunnels served more practical purposes, connecting different buildings within the complex during peaceful times. These provided convenience during sieges. They allowed defenders to move reinforcements quickly without crossing open areas where they might be targeted. False passages represented a darker aspect of these systems, deliberately designed traps for infiltrators. Some led to dead ends where enemies would be cornered. Others contained hidden pits with spikes at the bottom. Kavach Castle in Scotland featured a fake escape tunnel that led to a flooded chamber where intruders would drown. The secrecy of these passages created vulnerability as well as strength. Several castles fell because of betrayal involving hidden entrances. In 1330, Nottingham Castle was penetrated through a forgotten tunnel from a nearby tavern. At Chateau Gore, attackers discovered an unguarded toilet chute that allowed them to infiltrate the fortress. The castle designer, who forgot to put guards near the bathroom, probably had a really bad performance review. While secret passages provided crucial advantages during attacks, the ultimate defense remained the castle's ability to resist and counter the specialized siege weapons that attackers brought against its walls. Medieval siege machines were impressive, but castle defenders weren't just sitting around waiting to be crushed. They developed countermeasures that turned attacking a castle into a deadly game of medieval chess. When attackers rolled up with battering rams, giant logs with metal caps, defenders would drop massive stones directly onto them from the battlements. These weren't pebbles. We're talking about boulders weighing hundreds of pounds that could splinter wood and crush unfortunate soldiers below. The medieval equivalent of dropping a piano on someone's head, except nobody got a funny tune at the end. Fire was another favorite defender tool. When siege towers, those massive wooden structures on wheels, approached the walls, archers would unleash volleys of flaming arrows at them. Defenders also used long hooks on ropes to grab the towers and pull them off balance. Nothing ruins your day like climbing a 60-ute siege tower only to feel it suddenly leaning sideways like a drunk trying to climb stairs. Trebuchets presented a different challenge. These giant catapults could hurl stones from a distance, so defenders reinforced walls where impacts were expected and conducted nighttime raids to sabotage these machines. Some clever defenders even counted the seconds between launches to predict where to avoid standing. One particularly nasty siege tactic was biological warfare. Attackers would sometimes catapult diseased animal carcasses over the walls. The defenders' response: they catapulted some of the mess right back, along with beehives and wasps' nests. Talk about returning unwanted gifts with interest. Countermining was crucial when attackers tunneled under walls. Defenders dug their own tunnels to intercept them, flooding enemy tunnels with smoke or releasing attack dogs. Many castles kept specialized anti-siege equipment ready, including wooden frames called hoardings that could be quickly assembled to extend the range defenders could drop things from. While the previous section showed how castles used architecture to create death traps, these active defenses proved medieval defenders weren't just relying on thick walls. They fought back with ingenuity that would make modern military strategists proud. And when all else failed, they always had one more powerful weapon in their arsenal. Success in medieval warfare often came down to who could last the longest. Castles turned time itself into a weapon against attackers. Psychological warfare was a key strategy. Defenders would feast on battlements, making sure the smell of roasting meat drifted toward hungry besiegers. Medieval trash talk didn't need words, just a chicken leg waved tauntingly from a tower window. Sieges bankrupted attackers. A typical army in the 1300s cost about 500 gold pieces daily. After weeks of going nowhere, many lords simply ran out of money. The siege of Kenilworth Castle lasted 6 months before attackers gave up. Weather favored defenders. Winter sieges were brutal for armies camping outside. More soldiers died from cold disease and hunger than from fighting. Castle residents weren't staying at a 5-star resort, but compared to attackers sleeping in mud, they might as well have been. Castle defenders mastered surprise attacks called sorties. Small groups rushing out from hidden gates to target siege equipment or supply lines before quickly retreating. Deception helped too. Helmets on poles made it seem like more soldiers guarded the walls. Trumpets and drums created the impression of reinforcements arriving. The most effective defense was often patience. About 60% of castle sieges ended with attackers simply giving up. While the previous section showed how castles actively fought against siege machines, this combination of patience and psychological warfare completed their defensive strategy, turning stone structures into active participants in medieval power struggles. Medieval power struggles. Medieval power struggles. Medieval. Part 3. Why you wouldn't last. 24 hours in medieval times. Think your life is hard. You wouldn't last a single day in medieval times. Modern comforts have made us soft, and what medieval people dealt with daily would shock you to your core. Let's talk about medieval food. The stuff that would have you running back to the 21st century faster than you can say McDonald's. First off, forget everything you've seen in movies about grand feasts with giant turkey legs for regular folks. Meals were bland, boring, and often dangerous. Most people ate a diet that was about as exciting as watching paint dry. Peasants lived mainly on something called pottage, basically a sad, watery soup made from whatever vegetables they could grow cooked in the same pot for days. It was the medieval version of Mom's mystery stew. Except instead of hiding vegetables, it was hiding weevils. And dirt bread was the main food for almost everyone. But it wasn't the fluffy sliced stuff we enjoy today. Medieval bread was dense, dark, and often filled with all sorts of unwanted extras. The flour used was typically ground between stone wheels that would chip off into the mix. People back then had stronger teeth, not from good genes, but from constantly chewing on what was basically rock-filled dough. Here's a terrifying fact. Much of the bread contained ergot, a fungus that grows on rye. Ergot poison pruning cause hallucinations, burning sensations, and sometimes death. Some historians believe ergot poisoning may have contributed to witch hunt hysteria because entire towns would start hallucinating at once. Imagine thinking your neighbor is a witch, when really your baker just needed to clean his equipment. Meat was a luxury for most people. When they did get it, it was often borderline rotten. because there was no refrigeration to mask the taste of spoiling meat. They used heavy spices if you could afford them. Otherwise, you just held your nose and hoped for the best. The 5 sec rule in medieval times was more like the 5-day rule. The worst part, you couldn't even wash down this awful food with water because drinking it would make you sick. Most water sources were contaminated with human waste and other nasty stuff. Instead, everyone, including kids, drank beer or ale, not the strong stuff we have today, but a weaker version that was safer than water. Because the brewing process killed germs, one study found that the average medieval peasant consumed about 8 pints of ale per day. Children as young as 5 regularly drank ale with every meal. Medieval kids didn't need to fake IDs to drink. They needed them to get water. Instead, fish was another common food, but usually preserved by drying or salting. Since fresh fish spoiled quickly, people living by the coast might get fresh fish. But for inland dwellers, fish arrived days or weeks old. The smell alone would knock you out by now. Your stomach is probably turning. Which brings us perfectly to the next medieval horror for the average person going to the bathroom, meant using a chamber. Pot, basically just a bowl or bucket kept under the bed. Once filled, you'd either empty it yourself or wait for someone to collect it. Where did they empty it? Usually right out the window and into the street below. The medieval version of Look Out Below wasn't about falling objects, but falling feces. The common practice in towns was to simply shout Garde L before tossing waste from upper windows. This warning came from the French phrase garde, allo meaning watch out for the water. Of course, by water, they meant something far less pleasant. This practice was so common that in some medieval cities, the rule was that waste could only be thrown from windows after 10 at night. If you were lucky enough to visit a castle, you might encounter something called a garderobe, essentially a hole in a stone seat that dropped waste straight down the castle wall. In Dover Castle, archaeologists found a garderobe that dropped waste. Nearly 70 kings and queens might have had thrones, but their toilets were just holes with the draft for those who couldn't wait to get home to their chamber pot. The options were grim public areas often had designated spots where people would relieve themselves. Creating what we'd now call open sewers in London, there were places called common privies, built over rivers, but these were few and far between. The job of collecting and disposing of human waste fell to workers with the unfortunate title of gong farmers. These brave souls would collect waste from cesspits and take it outside. The city walls, they could only work at night, and the smell clung to them so badly they weren't allowed in public gathering places. Despite the awful conditions, gong farmers were actually paid quite well, about 4 times. What an ordinary laborer made, the smell of medieval cities was legendary. The River Thames in London was so polluted with waste that it was described as a monster of stink. Toilet paper, forget about it. People used whatever was available, leaves moss their left hand, or if they were wealthy pieces of wool or hemp. The Romans had actually used sponges on sticks that they would rinse in vinegar or salt water. But that knowledge was mostly lost by medieval times after spending a day drinking ale to avoid waterborne illness, and then finding nowhere decent to release yourself. You'd be ready to head back to the 21st century. But the bathroom situation was just one of many brutal realities that made medieval life a daily test of survival. Forget those romantic notions of being a valiant knight or a fair maiden in a castle. In medieval times, most people work back-breaking jobs from sunrise to sunset, with barely enough pay to survive. Most people were peasant farmers who worked the land, owned by nobles. Their daily routine: wake up at dawn, work until dusk, collapse into bed, repeat until death. A typical farmer plowed fields using wooden tools pulled by oxen, planted seeds by hand, and harvested crops with basic sickles. During harvest season, peasants worked 16-hour days, and the baking sun records from medieval England show that a typical farm worker would burn over 40 calories daily just from physical labor. Medieval farmers didn't need gym memberships, they just needed to survive Tuesday for those not farming trades and crafts offered alternative careers. Though these came with their own hardships, blacksmiths spent their days in smoke, filled forges breathing in toxic fumes and risking burns and eye injuries. Tanners who turned animal hides into leather worked with urine and toxic chemicals that turned their skin yellow and gave them horrible smells that followed them everywhere. Want to become a skilled tradesperson? Better start young apprenticeships typically began at age 7 when children would be sent to live with a master craftsman. These young apprentices worked 6 or 7 days a week for up to 14 years before they could become journeyman medieval career counselors. Had a pretty simple job. Selection flowchart: can you lift heavy things? If yes. Farmer if no early death. Some jobs were designed specifically for the poor and desperate link. Boys were children who carried torches to light the way for wealthy people. At night, pure finders collected dog feces to sell to tanners. The pay for most jobs would barely cover basic survival. A day laborer in medieval England might earn 1 or 2 pennies per day, just enough to buy about 2 loaves of bread. Getting paid minimum wage wasn't a concept. The concept was minimum you need so you don't die before finishing your work. With such physically demanding work and poor nutrition, your body would wear out quickly, disease was everywhere, medicine was practically non-existent. And what passed for healthcare would today be considered? Torture medieval WebMD had just one diagnosis for everything. You're probably going to die. A simple cold or flu that we treat with rest and over-the-counter medicine could be a death sentence without understanding of germs or infection. Medieval people believed illness came from bad air or an imbalance of the 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black. Bile got a fever time for bloodletting. This involved cutting open a vein and draining blood into a bowl. Medieval doctors had one solution for everything you've got: too much blood. Let me fix that for you. Leeches were another popular treatment. These blood-sucking parasites were applied to the skin to draw out bad blood. One medical text recommended using 70 leeches at once for certain conditions. The mortality rate from disease was staggering. About 30% of children died before age 5, and the average life expectancy was between 30 and 40 years. The bubonic plague killed roughly 50% of Europe's population. In the mid-14th century, dental problems were particularly awful, with no proper toothbrushes or understanding of dental hygiene. Tooth decay was common. Medieval dentists didn't need appointments. They just waited until someone was screaming loud enough to be heard through town. Even the medicines that were available were often deadly. Mercury was prescribed for everything from skin conditions to syphilis. Their prescription drugs didn't need warning labels about side effects. The side effect was always might kill you faster than the disease. The worst part: many diseases spread because of poor understanding of hygiene. Their idea of hand sanitizer was wiping their palms on their already filthy clothes, which is like trying to clean a muddy shoe with a dirty sock. Even if you somehow survived all these medieval medical treatments, your troubles were far from over. Life in the Middle Ages found plenty of other ways to make each day a challenge. Justice in medieval times wasn't just blind, it was downright cruel, unfair, and often completely random. The legal system operated on principles that would make modern lawyers scream in horror. First off, laws varied wildly from one town to the next. What was perfectly legal in one village could get you thrown in a dungeon just 5 miles away. There were no standardized legal codes, and most common people had no idea what was actually against the law until they were accused of breaking it. Medieval Miranda rights consisted of: you have the right to be punished, you have the right to beg for mercy. Good luck with that. The punishment rarely fit the crime. Minor offenses like stealing food when you were starving could result in having a hand chopped off. In medieval England, over 200 different crimes carried the death penalty, including cutting down a tree in the king's forest or stealing property worth more than 12p. Trials were nothing like our modern court system. If you were accused of a crime, proving your innocence often involved trial by ordeal. One common method was making the accused carry a red-hot iron bar for 9 FIT. If your burns healed cleanly within 3 days, you were innocent. If they became infected, which was almost guaranteed without modern medicine, you were guilty. Their version of a lie detector test was basically, let's see if God stops this painful thing from hurting you. Another popular method was trial. By water, the accused was tied up and thrown into a river or lake. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty and executed. The logic water being pure would reject the guilty. This created a literal no win situation for the accused, for those found guilty. Execution methods were designed to be as public and terrifying as possible. Hanging was actually one of the more merciful methods, drawing and quartering, where the condemned was dragged through streets by horses, hanged until nearly dead, disemboweled while still alive, beheaded and then cut into four pieces, was reserved for the worst crimes like treason. Public executions were community events, often drawing huge crowds who brought food and drinks as if attending a festival. Medieval entertainment options were limited. You could watch someone being executed or stay home and stare at your wall. Most people chose the execution. Nobles rarely faced the same justice system as commoners. If a noble was accused of a crime, they could often demand trial by combat and hire a professional fighter to represent them. Rich criminals could also pay blood money to victims' families to avoid punishment. Meanwhile, poor people accused of crimes had virtually no defense options. What about jails? Medieval prisons weren't meant for long-term punishment. They were holding cells until your actual punishment could be carried out. These dungeons were dark, overcrowded pits where prisoners were often chained to walls or floors. No food was provided by the state. Prisoners relied on family members to bring meals, or they simply starved. Torture was a standard part of the legal process, used not just for punishment, but to extract confessions devices like the rack, which stretched limbs until joints dislocated the Iron Maiden, or a coffin-like container lined with spikes and thumb screws which crushed fingers were used to get confessions. True or false? Most people confessed to anything just to end the torture, which usually led to executing Yushin. Anyway, the medieval justice system's motto might as well have been, confess or suffer then suffer. Anyway, public humiliation was a common punishment. For minor offenses, being locked in the stocks meant sitting in a public square with your head and hands trapped between wood and boards, while townspeople threw rotten food mud and worse at you. The ducking stool was used mainly for women accused of gossiping or arguing with their husbands. They would be strapped to a chair and repeatedly dunked underwater. Medieval law enforcement was equally primitive. There were no professional police towns hired. Night watchmen, who were often elderly men considered too old for regular work. Their main duty was to raise the alarm if they spotted a crime, or fire. Medieval cops didn't read you your rights. They just shouted, "Stop thief," and hoped someone in the crowd would stick out a leg to trip you. Even if you were innocent, simply being accused of a crime could ruin your life. The concept of innocent until proven guilty didn't exist. Once accused, you were basically presumed guilty, and the burden was on you to somehow prove otherwise through these horrific ordeals or trials. If the legal system didn't kill you, perhaps you'd survive long enough to experience another medieval terror. Medieval warfare was nothing like what you see in movies. Forget glorious battles with shining knights charging across open fields. Real medieval combat was chaotic, brutal, and almost certainly fatal for the average person. Wars happened constantly during the 100 Years' War between England and France. Fighting dragged on from 1337 to 1453. That's 16 years of on and of conflict. The average medieval person would experience multiple wars during their lifetime. Unlike today, where many people live their entire lives without seeing combat firsthand. Let's talk about armor. Only the wealthiest knights could afford full-plate armor, which cost roughly the equivalent of a modern sports car. A complete set of plate armor represented about 2 to 3 years' worth of income for a skilled craftsman. Most soldiers wore padded cloth garments called gambin, perhaps with a few metal plates sewn on. If they were lucky, knights in shining armor were the medieval version of people with expensive sports cars, rare showing off, and probably compensating for something. What about weapons? Swords were expensive and primarily used by knights, and nobility. Common soldiers used spears, axes, or agricultural tools modified for fighting. The most feared medieval weapon was actually the longbow, which could pierce most armor at close range. English longbowmen trained from childhood. developing deformed skeletons from the physical stress of drawing 200 Liberty bows. Thousands of times medieval battles were incredibly lethal. At the Battle of Tun in 1461, roughly 28,000 men died in a single day, about 1% of England's entire male population. Many froze to death in the snowstorm that accompanied the battle before they ever saw combat. Battle wounds were almost always fatal due to infection. Even if they weren't immediately life-threatening for peasants, the worst part of war wasn't even the battles, it was what armies did between fights. Medieval armies lived off the land, meaning they took whatever food and supplies they needed from local villages. This often involved burning crops, killing livestock, and destroying homes. Soldiers from both sides would ransack communities, leaving civilians to starve, the medieval version of support. Our troops meant, please don't take all our food and burn our houses. Sieges were particularly horrific when an army surrounded a castle or wall town. Those trapped inside faced slow starvation during the Siege of Paris. In 885 to 886, inhabitants resorted to eating rats, cats, and eventually each other's sieges could last months or even years. The Siege of Kind India, or modern Heraklion, during the 1600s, lasted 21 years. The longest siege in history. Disease killed far more soldiers than actual fighting armies. Created perfect conditions for illness, thousands of men living in close quarters with poor sanitation, limited food, and contaminated water during the Crusades. European armies often lost half their men to disease before ever reaching their destination. Medieval army medics had two treatments: rub some dirt on it for minor wounds and prepare to meet your maker for everything else. Civilians caught in war zones faced terrible choices. Fleeing meant abandoning homes and possessions, possibly facing starvation on the road. Staying meant risking violence from passing armies. Women and children weren't spared. Medieval chronicles describe entire villages being slaughtered, regardless of age or gender. If somehow you managed to avoid getting drafted into these bloody conflicts, survived the roaming armies, and didn't starve from war, caused famines, you'd still have to endure the general misery of everyday medieval life. The smell hit you first. Medieval towns are of human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies tanning Pat 3. Why you wouldn't last. 24 hours in medieval times. Chemicals. Slaughterhouse remains and smoke from countless fires without garbage collection. Trash piled up on streets or was tossed into the nearest river. Butchers dumped animal entrails and blood right outside their shops. The smell was so overwhelming that people carried small pouches of herbs called pee-onders to hold under their noses. The medieval version of air freshener was slightly less terrible smelling stuff to mask the horrible smelling stuff. Personal hygiene was practically non-existent. Most people bathed only a few times a year, usually in spring. And at the end of summer, many believed that bathing opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body during winter months. People might go 4 to 5 months without washing. Headlight were so common that special combs for removing them were standard grooming tools. Medieval dating profiles would have included only moderate lice infestation. As a major selling point, clothing was uncomfortable, rarely washed and worn until it fell apart. Undergarments were made of rough linen that irritated the skin. Outer garments were heavy wool that itches constantly, both rich and poor. Typically owned only 2 or 3 sets of clothes. Total shoes were made of thin leather with flat soles that provided no protection from the elements. The language barrier would be nearly insurmountable. Middle English from the 1400s. Sounds almost like a foreign language to modern English speakers. Common phrases like "Wyatt is thin," "Nama," or "What is your name?" would be incomprehensible. You'd struggle to understand others and they'd think you were speaking gibberish. Privacy didn't exist. Most households consisted of one room where everyone ate, worked, and slept together. Beds were shared by multiple family members, and sometimes travelers would share beds with strangers in even wealthy homes had servants present at all times. Including during private moments, entertainment options were limited and often violent public executions. Drew large crowds and were treated as festivals. Animal baiting, where dogs would attack chain bears, or bulls, was popular. Less violent options included watching traveling performers or listening to BS tell stories, but these were infrequent treats. The social hierarchy was rigid and unforgiving. The feudal system meant everyone had a fixed place, and social mobility was nearly impossible. About 90% of the population were peasants who owned nothing and worked land belonging to nobles. Moving up in the station or changing occupations rarely happened. Knowledge was limited and superstition filled the gaps most people believed in. Witches, demons, and magical creatures. Medical problems were attributed to evil spirits. Bad air or astrological influences. A solar eclipse could send an entire town into panic. Believing the world was ending. Medieval fact-checking consisted of asking the oldest person in the village if they'd heard the same thing. Before communication was slow and unreliable, news traveled at the speed of a walking messenger or horseback rider. Information from 50 mil away might take days to arrive, and news from other countries could take months if it arrived at all. By this point in our journey through medieval horrors, you'd be desperately searching for a way back to your comfortable modern life, with its antibiotics, indoor plumbing, human rights, and deodorant. The past may seem romantic in books and movies, but the reality of medieval life was a daily struggle that few of us modern humans could endure even for a day, or even for a day, or even for a day, or Part 4. This medieval crop is way better than potatoes, and no one grows it anymore. Before potatoes took over Europe, people had plenty of other amazing crops to rely on. These lost foods survived harsh winters, grew in bad soil, and kept medieval folks full and strong. But over time, they were forgotten. Want to know which medieval superfoods might be even better than potatoes? Let's dig up medieval cookbook and you'll find a surprising star: the humble parsnip. Before potatoes crossed the Atlantic in the 1500s, parsnips ruled European dinner tables for centuries. These pale, carrot-looking vegetables were absolutely everywhere in medieval kitchens. They were basically the medieval equivalent of French fries. Except nobody was asking, would you like a parsnip with that at the local tavern? Medieval farmers grew parsnips by the wagon load for good reason. Unlike modern vegetables that need perfect conditions, parsnips thrived in the harsh European climate. They survived freezing winters that would kill most crops, actually becoming sweeter after frost hit them. They're the only food in history that improves when you forget about it. Unlike that leftover stew turning into a science experiment in the back of your fridge, the nutritional value made parsnips invaluable during harsh winters. One medium parsnip contains about 100 calories and is packed with fiber, vitamin C, and potassium. For medieval peasants who typically consumed between 2,000 and 3,000 calories daily, much from bread, parsnips provided essential nutrients when fresh food was scarce. In particularly harsh winters, parsnips could make up nearly a third of a peasant's diet. What made parsnips truly special was their versatility. Medieval cooks mashed them like we do potatoes, roasted them alongside meats, and added them to stews for thickness and flavor. Parsnips were so naturally sweet they regularly appeared in medieval desserts. If a time-traveling medieval chef saw our grocery stores with aisles of cheap sugar, they'd faint faster than a knight in full armor on a summer day. Even more impressive was how parsnips grew in terrible soil. Medieval farming techniques weren't exactly advanced, and fields were often nutrient-depleted. While other crops failed, parsnips pushed their long tap roots deep into the ground, finding nutrients where other plants couldn't reach. Parsnips were basically the plant world's overachievers thriving in dirt. So bad, other vegetables would file a complaint with medieval management. Parsnips were so important, they appear in medieval taxation records. In many regions, farmers paid a portion of their parsnip harvest as tax to lords or the church. Nothing says important vegetable quite like the government wanting a cut of your root crop profits. Monasteries maintained huge parsnip fields to feed the poor during winter. Monks were basically running medieval food banks, except instead of canned goods, you'd get a sack of parsnips and a pamphlet about avoiding sin. The storage ability of parsnips was another medieval selling point. They could be left in the ground all winter, providing a ready food source when needed. Alternatively, they could be stored in cool, dry places for months, crucial before refrigeration existed. For medieval families, having a stockpile of parsnips meant survival through the hungry months of late winter when food stores ran low. So, what happened? When potatoes arrived from the Americas, they offered higher yields and were slightly easier to store long term. Within a few generations, the parsnip went from dinnertime hero to forgotten vegetable. The parsnip essentially got vegetable ghosted by European farmers after a thousand-year relationship. Talk about agricultural drama. Parsnips kept common folk alive through the harshest winters when other foods ran out. Medieval farmers didn't have time for complicated vegetable preparation. They had moats to dig and plagues to avoid. The parsnip's no-drama personality made it the perfect medieval fast food. Maybe we should take another look at what kept our ancestors fed long before potatoes arrived on European shores. Emmer was one of the first crops humans ever domesticated, dating back roughly 10,000 years. By medieval times, it had already been feeding civilizations for millennia. Medieval farmers didn't just grow crops. They were continuing an agricultural tradition older than most castles, cathedrals, and royal family trees combined. What made Emmer wheat special was its incredible hardiness. It thrived in poor rocky soil that would make modern wheat varieties fail. Despite wooden plows that barely scratched the earth's surface and fields that rarely got proper fertilization, Emmer wheat produced reliable harvests year after year. The nutritional profile of Emmer was impressive. It contains roughly 30% more protein than common wheat, plus higher levels of minerals like zinc, iron, and magnesium. Medieval bread made from Emmer wheat was dense, heavy, and often dark in color. If you dropped a medieval Emmer wheat loaf on your foot, you'd have a medieval medical emergency on your hands. This hearty bread was the foundation of the medieval diet, accounting for up to 70% of the average person's daily calories. Emmer wheat wasn't just important. It was vital enough to start riots when the harvest failed. Historical records document bread riots breaking out when grain supplies ran low or prices rose too high. Medieval folks took their carbs very seriously. Bread shortages caused more social upheaval than a modern internet outage. The grain was so valuable that it was often used as currency. Peasants frequently paid their taxes to lords in measures of grain rather than coins. Many monasteries and castles maintained grain stores vast enough to feed hundreds of people for months. So why did EMAT disappear? Beginning in the late medieval period, common wheat gradually replaced emmer because it was easier to process. Emmer has a tough husk that adheres tightly to the grain, requiring additional processing steps to remove. As medieval agriculture slowly industrialized, emmer fell out of favor despite its nutritional and hardiness advantages. Medieval bread made from emmer had a nutty, complex flavor that many food historians consider superior to modern wheat bread. Modern bread would seem suspiciously soft and bland to a medieval peasant. They'd probably assume you were trying to pass off cake as bread. Emmer wheat provided the daily sustenance that powered everything from cathedral construction to plowing fields. The dense, protein-rich bread gave medieval workers the energy to build the massive structures we still marvel at today. But bread alone wasn't enough to build those towering castles and cathedrals. Medieval workers needed something else. Ask a medieval farmer what kept workers strong enough to build castles, and they might point to a humble plant with broad leaves and stubby pods growing in neat rows near their cottage. Fava beans, also called broad beans, were medieval Europe's primary protein source long before modern meat production became commonplace. These unassuming legumes powered the muscles that built cathedrals, castles, and entire kingdoms. Unlike exotic spices or fine wines, fava beans weren't just for the wealthy. They appeared on tables from the poorest peasant vels to royal banquet halls. Archaeological digs at medieval sites consistently find fava bean remains in latrines and garbage pits across all social classes. The fava bean was basically the great social equalizer of the Middle Ages. The one food that both kings and peasants had to expel eventually. Fava beans earned their place in medieval agriculture through sheer efficiency. They produce more protein per acre than almost any other crop available at the time. A single acre of fava beans could yield up to yet 500 labi of dried beans, providing roughly 500 labi of complete protein, enough to supply approximately 20 people with their annual protein needs. For comparison, raising enough cattle to produce the same amount of protein would require about 15 acres of grazing land. The cultivation of fava beans also improved the soil rather than depleting it. Like other legumes, fava beans have a special relationship with bacteria that live in nodules on their roots. These bacteria capture nitrogen from the air and convert it to a form plants can use, essentially acting as living fertilizer factories. Medieval farmers didn't understand the science, but they observed that crops planted after fava beans often grew better. Many farming manuals from the period recommended rotating fields between grains and beans to maintain soil health. Fava beans were so essential to food security that they appeared in medieval law codes. In parts of England, local ordinances required every household with a garden to dedicate a portion to growing fava beans. French monastic records show that bean seeds were distributed to peasant farmers as a form of charity during times of shortage. Being forced to grow beans by law sounds like a medieval form of punishment, but it was actually closer to government-mandated health insurance. The nutritional profile of fava beans made them ideal for the medieval diet. They contain about 26% protein by weight when dried, along with high levels of fiber B vitamins and minerals like iron, manganese, and copper. Just 1 cup of cooked fava beans provides nearly half the daily protein needs for an adult. For medieval people who couldn't afford meat regularly, fava beans were often the difference between proper nutrition and malnutrition. How did medieval cooks prepare fava beans? Almost every way imaginable. When young and tender, the entire pods could be eaten fresh. More commonly, the dried beans were soaked overnight, then boiled and added to soup, stews, and porridges. Wealthier households might season them with expensive imported spices, while humble peasant families made do with herbs grown in their gardens. Some recipes called for mashing cooked beans into a paste, then forming them into patties, and frying them in lard or oil, essentially creating medieval veggie burgers. For the Lenten season, when church rules forbade meat consumption for 40 days, fava beans became even more important. During Lent, medieval monks living on beans and prayer might have experienced spiritual visions or maybe just an unprecedented level of flatulence. Either way, bean consumption spiked dramatically during religious fasting periods. Not everything about fava beans was beneficial, however. Some people of Mediterranean descent carry a genetic trait called glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency, which can cause a dangerous reaction called favism when they eat fava beans. The condition was recognized even in medieval times, though not understood scientifically. Medical texts from the period warned that some people became ill after eating beans, but didn't know why. As meat production became more efficient in later centuries, fava beans gradually lost their prominence in European agriculture. Yet their legacy remains in traditional dishes across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. In parts of Italy and Spain, dried fava beans are still ground into flour for bread, making continuing a tradition that stretches back over 1,000 years. Fav beans supplied the crucial protein that built medieval muscles and kept workers strong enough to construct massive stone buildings that still stand today. But protein alone couldn't provide every nutrient needed by the medieval body. For that, communities turned to a fast-growing crop that could be planted during gaps in the growing season. Buckwheat is the medieval fast food that kept people fed when other crops needed more time. Despite its name, buckwheat isn't related to wheat at all. It's actually a seed related to rhubarb. Calling buckwheat a type of wheat is like calling a guinea pig a type of pork. Completely misleading, but stuck with us anyway. Buckwheat's superpower was its incredible growing speed. While wheat demanded months to mature, buckwheat could be harvested in just 10 to 12 weeks. Medieval farmers often planted it as an insurance policy. If the main grain harvest failed, buckwheat could still prevent winter famine. It was basically the medieval equivalent of ordering pizza when you burn dinner. The backup plan that always delivers. This humble plant thrived in poor acidic soils where other crops struggled. It grew happily in rocky, sandy, or clay-heavy fields with minimal nutrients. It was essentially the "I'll eat whatever's in the refrigerator and won't complain" plant of the medieval farming world. Medieval cooks used buckwheat in porridge, pancakes, rustic bread, and even beer. The resulting dark beer was cheaper than barley beer, but still provided calories and nutrients. Medieval buckwheat beer probably tasted like liquid bread with a kick. But after a day of hauling stones for cathedral construction, nobody was posting one-star reviews about subtle flavor notes. The nutritional profile of buckwheat would make modern health influencers swoon. It contains all 8 essential amino acids, making it a complete protein source. Cup for cup, medieval buckwheat provided more protein than modern oatmeal, more antioxidants than many fruits and fiber content that puts white bread to shame. If medieval buckwheat had an Instagram account today, it would be posting gym selfies and selling nutrition plans. Even more remarkable was buckwheat's ability to improve soil health. Its quick, dense growth suppressed weeds and prevented erosion. Its roots released compounds that made phosphorus more available to future plantings. Medieval farmers didn't understand the chemistry, but they knew fields where buckwheat had grown produced better yields the following season. Buckwheat was basically fertilizing the fields and fighting weeds while also feeding people. The medieval multitasker that makes our attempts at work-life balance look pathetic. So why did buckwheat fall from favor? As agriculture industrialized, crops were valued based on yield and storage stability. Wheat, corn, and rice all store longer and produce more calories per acre. Buckwheat was essentially fired from its job as a major crop for being too quirky and independent. Qualities that might make for an interesting co-worker but don't fit with industrial agriculture. Today, buckwheat is sold at premium prices as a superfood, something that would baffle medieval farmers who saw it as humble emergency food. Medieval peasants would be shocked to see urban professionals paying $15 for a small bag of what was once considered the backup plan when better grains weren't available. You're paying how much for the emergency food? Did all the real food disappear? When winter set in and fresh foods became scarce, medieval communities relied on stored goods like buckwheat. But even in the harshest months, they found ways to supplement their diet with hardy greens that could withstand frost and snow. Good King Henry has triangular, arrow-shaped dark green leaves that somewhat resemble spinach. Unlike its modern cousins, it could survive brutal winter conditions. Frost that would kill most vegetables simply couldn't defeat it. Medieval winters were tough, but this plant was tougher. Like that one neighbor who wears shorts year-round, no matter the weather. The name Good King Henry likely comes from a corruption of Guter Heinrich, in German referring to household spirits believed to help around the home, appropriate for a plant that seemed to magically appear just when people needed it most. What made Good King Henry truly special was its versatility. Young shoots could be harvested in early spring and prepared like asparagus. The tender leaves were used in soups, stews, and medieval stuffing mixtures. The seeds could even be ground and added to flour for bread in times of extreme shortage. Nutritionally, Good King Henry was a powerhouse. Rich in vitamins A and C, it provided crucial nutrients when scurvy threatened winter health. The leaves contained significant amounts of iron, calcium, and potassium, all vital minerals often lacking in the limited winter diet of bread and preserved meats. Medieval households didn't grow Good King Henry in organized rows like modern vegetables. Instead, they encouraged it to grow in semi-wild patches near their homes. They would protect patches of the plant and scatter its seeds in convenient locations where it could thrive with minimal care. It was essentially medieval meal prep. Set it up once and then forget about it until dinner time. Once established, Good King Henry would return year after year without replanting. Some patches are known to have survived for decades, feeding multiple generations of the same family. Even in years when annual crops failed due to bad weather or political unrest, Good King Henry would still appear reliable as the seasons themselves. Despite its medieval popularity, Good King Henry almost completely disappeared from our diets by the 19th century. As farming became more commercialized, vegetables were increasingly valued for their yield, storage ability, and uniformity qualities. This wild-hearted plant lacked. Good King Henry essentially got pushed out of agriculture by vegetables with better marketing teams and more commercial appeal. Modern consumers would likely walk past a patch of Good King Henry to get to the organic spinach display at Whole Foods, never realizing they're ignoring a vegetable that kept their ancestors alive through countless harsh winters. While hardy greens like Good King Henry helped medieval people survive the lean months, they knew that survival required more than just vegetables. Every medieval village relied on another ancient crop. If you had to pick one crop that defined medieval life from sunup to sundown, barley would win the prize. This humble grain wasn't just food. It was breakfast, dinner, and the beverage that washed it all down. Barley was everywhere in medieval Europe. Archaeological evidence consistently shows it as the most commonly found grain, often accounting for over 50% of all grain remains. Unlike fancier grains, barley grew well in poor soil and harsh climates, making it ideal for the less than perfect farming conditions of medieval Europe. The versatility of barley made it particularly valuable. The grain could be ground into flour for bread, especially for the lower classes. It could also be boiled whole into a porridge that served as a staple breakfast across Europe. But barley's most significant role in medieval society was as the primary ingredient in beer, the daily beverage of choice for almost everyone. Water sources were often contaminated while the brewing process made beer safer to drink. Medieval folks weren't drinking beer all day because they wanted to party. They were just trying not to get sick from the water, which is probably the most responsible reason to be slightly buzzed at breakfast ever. The average medieval adult consumed between 1 and 5 L of beer daily. Manor records from 13th century England show that brewing used up to 30% of the total barley harvest in some areas. The brewing process kills harmful bacteria, and the resulting beer provides calories, nutrients, and safe hydration. Barley also played a crucial role in feeding medieval armies. Military campaigns relied on barley because it was lightweight when dried, could be quickly turned into porridge in field conditions, and traveled well without spoiling. The famous hard-tack biscuits that sustained armies were often made with barley flour. They were so tough that medieval soldiers probably had better dental insurance than we do today. Oh wait, they didn't have any, which explains a lot about medieval teeth. The nutritional profile of barley made it ideal for sustaining hardworking medieval bodies. 1 pound of barley contains approximately 1,650 calories and 50 grams of protein, roughly half the daily caloric needs for a medieval laborer, working in the fields or constructing a cathedral. Barley even influenced medieval social structures. Many tenant farmers paid their rent in barley, and feudal obligations often included helping with the barley harvest on the lord's land. Having a good barley harvest could literally determine whether a family would survive until the next year or face starvation. Interestingly, barley brewing created opportunities for women in medieval society. Brewing was often considered women's work in many parts of Europe until the later Middle Ages. Female brewers known as alewives produced beer in their homes and sold the surplus. These medieval businesswomen were basically running the equivalent of craft breweries long before bearded guys in flannel shirts made it trendy. Surprisingly, many food experts and farmers are beginning to look back at these resilient crops with renewed interest, especially as we face challenges our medieval ancestors would have understood all too well. These forgotten medieval crops aren't just historical curiosities. They might be exactly what modern agriculture needs. As climate change brings unpredictable weather and soils struggle to support intensive farming, these ancient varieties offer surprising solutions. Medieval crops like fava beans naturally fixed nitrogen in the soil, while buckwheat made phosphorus more available and suppressed weeds. Emmer wheat thrived in poor soil that would make modern varieties fail. Parsnips survived harsh winters and improved in flavor after frost. As weather patterns become more extreme, these hardy crops offer reliability when modern varieties might fail. The nutritional profiles also deserve another look. Ancient varieties like emmer contain more protein and minerals than modern wheat. Buckwheat offers complete protein and better blood sugar control. These medieval crops were basically superfoods before influencers started charging $20 for smoothies made with them. Small-scale farmers and chefs are already leading the revival. Emmer wheat has reappeared as farro on restaurant menus. Craft brewers are experimenting with historical grain varieties. Food security experts point to these forgotten crops as important tools for agricultural diversity. Medieval peasants would probably be confused to see their survival foods rebranded as luxury items, but they definitely appreciate the irony of rich people suddenly discovering what kept poor folks alive for centuries. Maybe it's time we learn from the practical wisdom of medieval farmers who managed to feed populations without fossil fuels, chemical fertilizers, or global supply chains. Global supply chains. Global supply chains. Global. Part 5. 15. Cheap meals. Medieval peasants. Ate to stay alive, think your grocery bill is high. Medieval peasants had it worse. They had to stay alive on whatever they could find or grow. These 15 cheap meals weren't fancy, but they kept generations fed through plague, famine, and endless hard work. And at the top of that list, Pottage ever had a house guest who just wouldn't leave. That's basically what pottage was to medieval peasants, except they actually wanted it to stick around. This legendary soup was the ultimate waste not dish of the Middle Ages simmering endlessly over the fire. Like the world's most patient dinner, pottage wasn't just any soup, it was the soup. The cornerstone of medieval peasant nutrition and the original set it and forget it meal. Unlike our modern quick dinners that disappear after one sitting, pottage was a deliberate lifestyle, a practical solution to the harsh realities of medieval life at its core. Pottage was simply a thick, hearty stew that stayed alive for days or even weeks. The cooking pot rarely left the hearth with new ingredients tossed in as others were eaten. The medieval version of a never-ending buffet, but with considerably fewer options and much less variety. What went into pottage? The better question is, what didn't the base typically consisted of? Whatever grain was cheapest and most available, bar oats or rye boiled. Until it broke down into a thick porridge-like consistency. From there, peasants added whatever vegetables they could get their hands on: turnips, onions, leeks, cabbage, and if they were lucky, carrots or peas. One study of medieval food remains found that the average peasant household kept their pottage going for at least 4 days before starting fresh, though many families maintain their pot for much longer during lean winter months. Archaeological evidence from medieval village sites shows that pottage ingredients became increasingly limited, often reduced to just grains and root vegetables, while all social classes ate some version of pottage. There was a world of difference between peasant pottage and what bubbled in noble kitchens. Wealthy households enhanced their pottage with expensive imported spices, bits of meat, and even wine. Meanwhile, peasant pottage relied on local herbs for flavor: garlic, parsley, sage, or whatever grew nearby on special occasions. Or after a successful hunt, a peasant family might drop a small piece of salt pork or bacon into their pottage pot. Not enough to make a meal of meat, but just enough to infuse the entire pot with flavor. The fat would rise to the top, providing precious calories during hard times. Some historians believe medieval peasants consumed as much as 2 to 3 pints of pottage daily, making it the true fuel of the feudal system. Not exactly a meal worth posting on social media, but it kept countless generations alive through centuries of hardship. Pottage may have been the never-ending soup of medieval times, but it wasn't the only thing that kept peasants on their feet. Bread connects us all from ancient times to modern kitchens. It remains the world's most universal food, but the loaves that graced medieval peasant tables would make most of us today turn up our noses, forget fluffy white bread or artisanal sourdough. Medieval peasant bread was dark, dense, and often as hard as the lives of those who ate. It made primarily from rye or barley grains that grew in poor soil. Where wheat struggled, these loaves bore little resemblance to what we call bread today. The grain for peasant bread wasn't just different, the entire process was first. The grain was often of poor quality. The best wheat went to nobles and clergy who could afford it. Second, peasants paid hefty fees to have their grain ground at the Lord's mill. To save on these costs, many would mix in fillers, ground peas, beans, acorns, chestnuts, and in desperate times, ground tree bark or straw. How much bread did the average peasant eat? The numbers are staggering. Records from medieval England show that a working man might consume 2 or 3 pounds of bread daily, providing over 60% of their total calories. Women and children ate proportionally similar amounts. This wasn't gluttony. Heavy labor in the fields required massive caloric intake, and bread delivered those calories cheaply. The baking process itself self-revealed the stark class divisions of medieval society. Wealthy households enjoyed fresh bread, daily peasants lacking private ovens. Typically baked just once a week in communal village ovens or fashion flatbreads that could cook on simple hearthstones. These weekly loaves grew progressively harder and molder as the days passed, requiring a dunk in pottage or ale to become edible. Again, by week's end, perhaps the most unsettling aspect of medieval bread was the potential for poison. Rye, the peasant grain of choice in many regions, was susceptible to ergot fungus, a naturally occurring hallucinogen containing compounds similar to LSD. Entire villages sometimes experienced mass hallucinations, convulsions, and even death from what was called St. Anthony's fire. What they couldn't know was that their daily bread was to blame, yet for all its dangers and deficiencies. Bread was sacred in medieval culture. Stealing bread was punished severely, wasting it considered sinful. The medieval table began with bread and ended with bread when famine struck. As it regularly did, families might survive for weeks on bread alone. Though the definition of bread became increasingly creative, the dark, dense loaves that fueled medieval labor rarely came with a compens. But when peasants were lucky enough to have something to put on their bread, it was often something simple that required little preparation. After a long day working the fields in medieval cuisine, the answer was gruel. Essentially, one step above consuming being boiled water with a spoon, when bread became scarce and pottage ingredients ran low. GRL stepped in as the final defense against an empty stomach. "Please, sir, I want some more," might be a want. The famous literary line associated with GRL, but medieval peasants rarely had the luxury of seconds. GRL was survival food, plain and simple, made by boiling a small amount of grain and a large amount of water. It stretched minimal ingredients to their absolute limit. The recipe, if you could call it that, couldn't be simpler. Take oats, barley, or whatever grain scraps remained in the bottom of the storage bin. Add water until the mixture looked desperately thin. Then cook until it resembled something edible. If you were particularly fortunate, you might have a pinch of salt to add the result. A watery, bland substance that filled the belly without satisfying any other human desire. Gruel differed from pottage in its deliberate thinness, and from porridge in its sad lack of substance. Medieval records indicate that during the harshest famines, monasteries feeding the poor would stretch a single cup of oats into gruel that served 10 people. The mathematician in the room might observe that this works out to less than 2 tablespoons of grain per person. Hardly a meal by any standard. Interestingly, gruel wasn't just for the desperately poor. Monks across medieval Europe regularly consumed gruel as part of their religious practice. Monastery kitchen records from the 12th century show that monks ate GRL during fasting periods, with one abbey documenting consumption of GRL twice daily during Lent. Their bowls might occasionally include honey or dried fruit luxuries. Ordinary peasants could only dream about. For the sick and elderly, GRL became medieval healthcare. Those too ill to chew bread or too weak to digest heartier foods were fed GRL until they recovered or didn't. Medieval medical texts recommend GRL for ailments ranging from fever to toothache, suggesting additions like herbs or wine for medicinal purposes. Of course, peasants rarely had access to such fancy versions. Children weaning from breast milk often transitioned directly to gruel, creating generations of Europeans who never knew the concept. Of baby food, court records from medieval England occasionally mention children who died of malnutrition, despite being fed GRL regularly, a grim reminder of its nutritional inadequacy. The taste about what you'd expect. Contemporary accounts describe it as thin, watery, and occasionally slimy, hardly a ringing endorsement. One medieval writer noted that even the dogs turn from it unless truly starving, which tells you everything you need to know. When even GRL became too luxurious due to grain shortages, medieval peasants turned to another reliable crop that thrived in poor soil and stored through winter turnips. The forgotten vegetable of modern cuisine once reigned supreme in medieval kitchens. While today's shoppers might pass them by without a second glance, that these humble roots kept countless peasants alive through centuries of hardship. What made turnips so essential to medieval survival? First, they grew almost anywhere. Poor soil turnips thrived. Short growing season turnips managed little. Attention from busy farmers' turnips forgave the neglect. A single turnip seed could yield up to 15 pounds of food, making them among the most efficient crops a peasant could plant. Turnip stew became the medieval equivalent of fast food quick filling and available year round. The basic recipe required minimal effort. Chop turnips, add water, boil until soft, season with salt if available. That's it. No fancy techniques, no rare ingredients. Just pure sustenance. Storage was another turnip superpower. Long before refrigeration, medieval peasants stored turnips in cool, dry cellars where they remained edible for months. Some villages dug specialized turnip pits, essentially underground storage chamber lined with straw or turnips kept fresh from harvest until late spring. Records from one English manor in 1286 noted that turnips stored this way fed village families for 7 months after harvest. Unlike many vegetables, the entire turnip was edible. Roots went into stews, leaves were added to pottage, and even the flowers could be eaten in spring. Nothing went to waste. Medieval field records suggest that a family of four needed to grow about 200 pounds of turnips to survive winter, a goal achievable in a surprisingly small garden plot. The humble turnip even played a role in medieval medicine. Folk healers prescribed turnip juice for coughs and turnip juices for skin ailments. One monastery medical text claims, "Turnips drive away winter melancholy," perhaps an early recognition of the nutritional benefits of fresh vegetables during vitamin-scarce winter months. Of course, eating turnips day after day had its downsides. Medieval writers occasionally complained about the sameness of peasant meals, with one noting that the poor eat turnips until their skin takes on the power of the root. Itself, another drawback was less aesthetic and more aromatic. Turnips, especially when reheated repeatedly, developed a distinctive smell that permeated medieval homes. For all their benefits, turnips weren't exactly celebration food. When asked what feast he would prepare, if suddenly wealthy, a medieval peasant reportedly answered the same turnips. But with meat, this humble aspiration speaks volumes about medieval culinary reality. While turnips may have dominated the medieval table, they rarely appeared alone. Another vegetable duo frequently joined them, creating a trio of flavors that, while simple, offered both nutrition and a welcome break from turnip monotony. Could two vegetables clear a medieval peasant hut faster than the plague? Cabbage and onions certainly tried their best. This odorous duo formed the backbone of peasant cooking across Europe, adding much-needed flavor to otherwise bland meals, while simultaneously testing the limits of medieval ventilation. Cabbage earned its spot in peasant gardens by being super useful. A single cabbage plant could grow very big, with heads weighing up to 15 lamabis. Old farm records showed that 10 cabbage plants could feed a family for months, taking up very little garden space. The outer leaves could be picked throughout the growing season, while the middle kept growing like food that replaced itself as you ate it. Saving cabbage made it truly valuable. Fresh cabbage lasted weeks in cool storage, but soured cabbage, what we now call sauerkraut, kept for months. Diggers found old cabbage pits in medieval villages where people let cabbage sour. One dug-up pit from a 1300s village had leftover bits from over 100 cabbages, saved together enough to feed several families all winter. Onions work perfectly with cabbage in old-time cooking. Tough and hard to kill, they grew in the worst dirt and stored without any special tools. Old garden books told people to plant onions around other crops to keep bugs away, making them twice as useful in small peasant gardens, where every bit of space mattered. Together, these veggies turned plain food into something with real taste boiled together. They made a simple side dish added to soup. They gave more flavor mixed with tiny bits of meat. They became a feast. Old tax records sometimes list cabbage and onions as okay payment for small debts, showing how much people valued them. Every day, the belly troubles from these veggies were well known back then. Old court records from many villages talk about problems caused by the too much gas after cabbage meals. One rule in a monastery banned cabbage on days when monks had important visitors, hinting that the farts afterward weren't good for polite company. Oddly enough, old-time doctors didn't trust veggies. Rich people's doctors often warned nobles not to eat poor people plants like cabbage, saying they made you sad and slow-thinking. Meanwhile, the poor folks eating these veggies every day lived on much less food than the rich, and probably had fewer of the food-related illnesses that rich people often got for all their benefits. Cabbage and onions couldn't supply everything. A hard-working peasant needed a diet with only these vegetables even with bread and pottage. Didn't have enough protein. Medieval peasants knew this by instinct, if not by science, which led them to seek protein wherever they could find it. Medieval folks didn't have protein shakes, but they did have mushy peas and beans. These humble crops were the everyday heroes of the peasant diet, providing the strength needed for long days of hard work in the fields. Peas and beans offered what bread and cabbage couldn't. Real protein-dried peas contained about 25% protein by weight, making them worth their weight in gold during winter months when meat was scarce or gone completely. A small patch of peas could yield up to 60 lbs of dried peas, enough to help a family through the leanest months growing. These protein-packed foods was simple enough, even for the worst farmers' peas and beans, fixed nitrogen in the soil, which meant they could grow in fields where other crops had used up all the good stuff. Smart peasants planted peas and beans between rows of other veggies, or after harvesting grain. Getting extra food from the same patch of land, the most common way to eat peas and beans was mashed after soaking dried peas or beans. Overnight, peasants boiled them until soft, then mashed them into a thick paste. Salt was added if available, and maybe wild herbs. If they were lucky, the result looked a bit like baby food, but packed a nutritional punch that kept workers going through 12-hour workdays during the harshest times. Pea and bean mash became the main meal rather than a side dish. Old records from one English village during the famine of 1315 note that families survived for weeks on nothing but the mash and small beer with bread. Becoming a luxury, monks across Europe relied heavily on these humble foods. Church rules banned meat on many days of the year, sometimes more than half the calendar, making peas and beans vital to monastery kitchens. Count books from a large abbey show they stocked over 3,000 lbs of dried peas yearly for just 40 monks. That's 75 pounds per monk. Storage was another big plus, while fresh peas and beans lasted only days. The dried versions kept for years. If stored right, peasant homes often had clay pots or wooden barrels of dried legumes tucked away as insurance against bad harvests. One dig at a peasant home found peas still in storage pots from 10 years earlier, still edible if not exactly tasty. The downside, same as cabbage. These foods cause gas. Medieval health guides warned against eating too many beans before church services or court appearances. One old joke told of a bean farmer who couldn't sell his crop because he tested too much of his product on the way to market, while peas and beans kept peasants alive and healthy enough to work. They weren't exactly exciting to eat day after day. Medieval peasants still crave variety in their meals. Whenever they had the chance to add something different to their cooking pots, they jumped at the opportunity, and sometimes that opportunity came from surprising sources. Eat what you can get. This was the golden rule of medieval meat eating for the poor. While nobles dined on roasted venison and fat capons, peasants made do with the bits nobody else wanted. The organs, feet heads, and odd scraps that today we call awful animal butchering. In medieval times followed strict rules about who got what parts. The lord of the manor claimed the best cuts, the tenderloins, plump breasts, and meaty haunches. Town folks with money bought the decent middle-grade pieces, what remained for peasants. Everything else but medieval peasants were masters at turning these scraps into food worth eating. Take the humble pig head after a pig slaughter peasant. Families often receive the head as partial payment for their work. Nothing went unused. The cheeks provided small but tender meat portions. The ears were clean, sliced, and fried. Crisp, the snout and lips went into jelly dishes. Even the brain was scooped out and scrambled. Like eggs, larger animals provided even more awful options. Cow stomachs cleaned and boiled became the container for haggis, like mixtures of grain and bits of heart or liver. Sheep lungs sliced thin and fried with onions, offered a quick meal after butchering. Day blood from any animal became blood pudding when mixed with grain and cooked in a cleaned intestine casing. Game animals too small for the Lord's table often ended up in peasant cooking pots. Whole squirrels, hedgehogs, and even rats in desperate times provided tiny portions of meat that flavored otherwise plain vegetable dishes. Records from one medieval village during a harsh winter mention peasants trapping and eating badgers, foxes, and other animals, typically considered inedible. The unwritten rule was simple. If it couldn't kill you, it was food this waste. Nothing approached stretched tiny amounts of animal protein to feed many mouths. A single cow's organs could provide meals for several families, while the prime cuts fed just one noble household for a day or two. Court records reveal how valuable these scraps were. Theft of offal was punished severely sometimes, with the same penalties as stealing more valuable cuts. One medieval English town recorded finding a man for stealing a sheep's pluck. The heart, liver, and lungs equal to 2 weeks' wages? Preservation techniques for offal were necessarily quick without refrigeration organs. Spoiled rapidly smoking, salting, and immediate cooking were the only options. Many offal dishes became linked to butchering days, eaten within hours of the animal slaughter. In an almost ceremonial feast for people living near coasts or rivers, another source of protein swam. Within reach, medieval folks didn't have drive-thrus, but they did have salted herring. The original grab-and-go meal, these preserved fish were the fast food of the Middle Ages, ready to eat without cooking and packed with enough salt to make you thirsty for days. Herring became the fish of choice for medieval peasants for choice. 3 simple reasons: they swam in huge groups, were easy to catch, and could be preserved with simple salt fishing records from medieval times. Show just how massive the herring industry was during peak season. A single fishing fleet from Great Yarmouth in England could haul in more than 40 million herring in just a few weeks. That's enough fish to give every person in medieval England 7 fish each. The salt preservation process was quick but smelly work. Fresh herring spoiled within a day. So fishing boats often carried salt on board. Workers gutted the fish, packed them in heavy salt, and stored them in wooden barrels right on the deck. The smell was so strong that har and processing areas of medieval towns had their own districts safely downwind from where most people lived for peasant salted. Herring became the answer to many food problems. First, it solved the meat ban during religious fasting days. The church banned meat on Fridays during Lent and on many other holy days, sometimes totaling more than half the year. Fish remained allowed, making herring a crucial protein source for those times. Second, herring could travel far from the coast without spoiling, packed in barrels. These fish reached deep inland, where fresh fish never could trade. Records show barrels of herring moving hundreds of miles from the sea, reaching mountain villages and remote farms. Third, no cooking needed. While fresh herring required cooking, the heavily salted version could be eaten. Acis, a medieval version of ready-to-eat food for busy peasants, working from dawn to dusk. A quick meal of herring and bread save precious time and fuel the cheapest. Herring came white, simp, gutted, and salted. Those with a bit more money might buy red herring, which were salted and then smoked for days until they turned a reddish-brown color and lasted even longer. The smoking process made them less salty and gave them a stronger flavor that some preferred. Just how many herrings did medieval Europeans eat? Tax records tell an amazing story. The small Baltic island of Scania processed more than 300 million herring annually. In peak years, a single monastery in York bought 15,000 herring yearly to feed just 30 monks. That's 500 fish per monk per year, or more than 1 herring every single day, of course. Eating fish day after day got boring. Fast medieval cooks found ways to make herring more interesting, chopping them into spreads, adding them to pies, or soaking them to remove salt before cooking. But no matter how they prepared it, herring breath remained an occupational hazard of being medieval after a salty meal. Medieval peasants needed something to wash it down with, and their drink of choice wasn't water. Water in medieval times could be deadly. Wells were often dug too close to uses. Rivers caught sewage from upstream towns, and most people had no idea that dirty water could make you sick. They just knew that people who drank from certain water sources often fell ill, while those who stuck to ale stayed healthy. The brewing process accidentally solved this problem. Boiling the water for brewing killed harmful germs, and the alcohol helped prevent new ones from growing. Medieval people didn't understand the science, but they saw the results clearly enough. Drinkers were healthier than water drinkers. Ale in medieval times wasn't the strong stuff we think of today. Small ale or small beer contained just enough alcohol to preserve it, about 1 to 3%, similar to modern light beer. This weak brew was an everyday drink for everyone, including children. Yes, medieval kids drank ale with breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but they weren't stumbling around drunk. It was more like drinking very flavorful water. How much ale did the average person drink? Medieval records tell an amazing story. Many adult workers received the allowances of a gallon per day, that's 8 pints. Manor records show that during harvest time, when work was hardest, this might increase to a gallon and a half. No wonder medieval workers took so many breaks during the day. They had a lot of liquid to process. Brewing was usually women's work done right at home. The basic recipe was simple heat water adding malted grain, strain out the grain, add flavor with herbs, then let it ferret. Most women brewed once or twice a week, making the family's supply in wooden tubs before storing it in pottery jugs or wooden barrels. Ale spoiled quickly without refrigeration, usually within a week. This meant it was truly a local food, made and consumed within the same community. It also meant brewing was a constant chore for medieval households, as necessary and regular as making bread. Speaking of bread, ale and bread were intimate partners in medieval kitchens. Both needed grain, both used yeast for fermentation, and many households made them together on brewing day. Leftover ale could be used in bread dough, while bits of bread could start the fermentation for the next ale batch. Nothing went to waste. Ale even served as payment. Medieval work records show that many tasks were rewarded with both money and ale. Building a section of village wall might earn you 3p plus 2 gallons of ale. Church bell ringers often receive payment in ale rather than coins. One English village paid its rat catcher with a weekly jug, perhaps to help him forget what he did all day for special occasions. And celebrations, peasants might enjoy stronger drinks with more flavor. And kick the contrast between medieval peasants sipping cider and today's folks buying expensive drinks couldn't be more striking. While cider and mead were treats for the poor, they weren't luxury items but practical solutions to food storage problems, and rare sources of sweetness in an otherwise bland diet. Cider became the drink of choice in areas where apples grew well. Apple trees had major advantages for peasant farmers once planted. They produced fruit for decades with minimal care, even better. They could grow on hillsides too steep for regular crops, making use of otherwise wasted land in parts of England. France and Spain, almost every peasant household had rights to at least a few apple trees. Making cider involved simple tools and basic steps. Peasants collected apples, crushed them in wooden presses, collected the juice, and left it to ferment. Naturally, the wild yeast on apple skins started fermentation without any extra help. After a few weeks, the sweet juice transformed into a mildly alcoholic drink that could keep for months, much longer than the apples themselves would have lasted. Strong cider contained about 4 to 8% alcohol, enough to feel good after a few cups. But not so strong that workers couldn't function the next day. Weaker versions were everyday drinks, while the stronger batches were saved for special occasions. Like weddings and harvest festivals, me offered an even sweeter escape from daily troubles made by fermenting honey with water. Me was the oldest known alcoholic drink in Europe. However, honey was expensive and hard to get making. Mead much rarer than ale or cider for average peasants. Most peasants only tasted meat a few times a year, usually at Christmas, Easter, or when celebrating weddings. Some clever peasants kept their own beehives, providing honey for both sweetening food and making small batches of meat. A single hive could produce 15 to 20 pounds of honey, yearly enough for a family to make a few gallons of mead, and still have honey for other uses. Both cider and mead served important practical purposes. Beyond just tasting good, the alcohol helped preserve the natural sugars in apples and honey far longer than they would have lasted. Otherwise, in an age without refrigeration, turning sweet things into alcohol was a smart storage solution. Medieval kitchen records showed that cider could last 6 months to a year. if stored in cool cellars while properly made mead. Could last several years, these sweet drinks also provided valuable calories during hard times when bread supplies ran low. A cup of cider or mead delivered quick energy records from one English village during a food shortage mentioned adults drinking cider as a meal replacement when grain supplies dwindled. Speaking of sweetness while honey made meat possible, it also served many other purposes in medieval kitchens, joining forces with other rare sweet treats. Sugar wasn't something most medieval peasants ever tasted. This expensive import remained firmly in the realm of the wealthy, who used it both as food and medicine for the common folk. Sweetness came directly from nature in the form of honey and wild berries treats that brightened an otherwise dull diet. Honey stood as the king of sweet ERS in the medieval world. Unlike sugar, it could be produced locally, though not without risk and effort. Brave peasants gathered wild honey by following bees to their hives, smoking them to reduce stinging and cutting out honeycomb chunks. This dangerous work often resulted in multiple stings but yielded liquid gold that made the pain worthwhile. Some clever peasants took beekeeping a step further. Old farming guides describe simple beehives made from hollow logs, straw skeps or clay pots placed in sunny spots near flowering plants. A well-managed hive could produce 15 to 20 pounds of honey, yearly an incredible luxury for a peasant family village records. Sometimes list beehives as valuable enough to include in wills and marriage contracts alongside land and livestock. Honey did much more than sweeten food. Medieval medical guides recommended it for healing wounds, soothing coughs, and preserving other medicines as a practical tool. Honey stickiness made it useful for setting hairstyles and even removing unwanted body hair when mixed with other ingredients. These multiple uses made honey all the more precious to those lucky enough to have access to it. When a tiny bit of honey was available, peasants used it with incredible care, adding just a drop to morning porridge, spreading the thinnest layer on bread, or using it to make a special treat for a sick family member, court records. From one medieval English village mention a woman accused of stealing a honey pot. Her punishment was nearly as severe as if she'd stolen a cow, showing how valuable the sweetener was. Wild berries provided seasonal bursts of sweetness that required only the labor of gathering strawberries. Blackberries, blueberries, and raspberries grew wild in forests and field edges, free for anyone with time to pick them. Unlike honeyberries, couldn't be preserved easily without sugar, so they remained strictly seasonal treats. Berry picking became a community activity with children, often sent out in groups to gather these precious fruits. Medieval feast records reveal how special these sweet foods were when a lord wanted to impress guests. Dishes featuring honey and berries often appeared at the end of meals for peasants invited to these rare feasts. Tasting honey-sweetened berry desserts might be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. One old joke told of a peasant who, when asked what he'd do if he were king for a day, replied he would eat berries with honey until my belly ached in a simple dream that shows how rare this combination was for ordinary people. When berries and honey weren't available, medieval peasants sometimes found other starchy foods to fill their hungry bellies. Maybe squirrels were onto something. After all, medieval peasants often turned to the forest floor for food. Gathering nuts that modern folks might walk right past, acorns and chestnuts became crucial backup foods when grain supplies ran low. Turning forests into emergency pantries, chestnuts were the easier of the two to use. Unlike acorns, chestnuts taste sweet naturally and don't require extensive processing in areas with chestnut forests, especially parts of France, Italy, and Spain. Chestnuts became known as the bread tree because they provided starchy nutrition. Similar to grain, a good chestnut harvest could save a village from winter hunger. How important were chestnuts' tax records from some medieval villages assessed a household's wealth? Partly by how many chestnut trees they had access to in parts of France, chestnuts made up nearly 20% of the peasant diet during winter months. One large chestnut tree could produce up to 200 lycobees of nuts in a good year, enough to keep a family alive for weeks if grain ran short. Medieval peasants prepared chestnuts in several ways. Roasting was the simplest, just toss them in hot ashes until the shells cracked open. Boiling removed more of the tannic acid and made them easier to digest for long-term storage. Chestnuts were often dried and ground into flour that could be mixed with grain flour to stretch bread supplies. This chestnut flour didn't rise as well as wheat flour, but it filled empty stomachs. Just the same, acorns required much more work, but could save lives during famine. The bitter tannins in raw acorns make them inedible without processing. Medieval peasants developed methods to remove these bitter compounds, usually by repeatedly soaking crushed acorns in water. The process took days and used lots of water, but the resulting acorn meal could be mixed with grain flour to make barely palatable emergency bread during the great famines that struck Europe every few decades. These tree nuts became true lifesavers. Court records from the famine of 1315 to 1317 mention people fighting over access to nut gathering grounds, showing just how valuable these forest foods became when other options disappeared even in normal times. Clever peasants gathered and stored nuts as insurance against poor harvests. Dried properly, both acorns and chestnuts could last for years. Years. One medieval farming manual recommends storing chestnuts in sand to prevent mold and keep them fresh longer. The forest provided these staples, but it offered much more to those who knew where to look. Some medieval villages had strict rules about who could gather which forest foods and when, showing just how important these wild resources were to everyday survival. When truly desperate times came, peasants turned to an even wider range of hunted foods from fields and forest. Medieval wild food gathering followed the changing seasons, with each month offering different options. Spring brought tender young greens like dandelions, nettles, and sorrel that appeared when food stores were often at their lowest. Young nettles, despite their sting, were among the most valuable spring finds, packed with vitamins and minerals after the long winter diet of grain, and preserved foods. Peasants used thick gloves or special picking techniques to harvest them without getting stung, then boiled them to remove the thing. Summer expanded the wild menu dramatically, meadows and woods filled with edible mushrooms, though picking them required careful knowledge. One medieval village record mentions a family that died after eating poisonous mushrooms during a food shortage, a grim reminder of the risks. Safer options included wild garlic, chickweed, and lamb's quarters, all of which could be added to pottage to stretch meager supplies. Wild onion relatives grew abundantly in many regions. Records show that during the famine years of 1310 to 1302, many communities survived partly on wild leeks and ramps dug from forest floors. These strong, flavored plants provided both nutrition and flavor when little else was available. Fall brought nuts, as we've seen, but also rose hips, hawthorn berries, and crab apples, all rich in vitamin C and natural preservatives. These tart fruits rarely made tasty eating on their own, but could be stored for winter medicine, and flavoring medieval cookbooks times mention these wild fruits as additions to more palatable foods. The gathering skills of peasant women earned special recognition in medieval documents. Manor court records occasionally mention women known as particularly skilled finders of foods, who could locate edible mushrooms, identify useful plants, and knew where the best wild fruit grew. These women sometimes received payment for teaching others or leading gathering groups during hard times. Just how important were these wild food studies of medieval diet suggests that in normal years, gathered plants might make up 5 to 10% of peasant nutrition during famines. This could jump to 30% or more. One account from the Great Famine tells of villages surviving almost entirely on gathered greens and tree bark for weeks. Medieval law recognized the importance of these foods. Too many forests and woodlands had specific gleaning rights that allowed peasants to collect wild foods even on lands they didn't own. Legal disputes over these rights appear repeatedly in court records, showing their crucial importance to survival. When even wild plants became scarce, desperate times called for desperate measures. Some medieval peasants turned to making bread from unusual ingredients, using methods that would make even the toughest stomach turn. Ash cakes represented the last line of defense against starvation, a type of primitive bread that could be made with minimal ingredients and zero kitchen tools. The concept was brutally simple. Take whatever ground meal you had, mix it with water to form a thick paste, flatten it into a patty, and cook it directly in the hot ashes of a fire. No oven, no baking stone, not even a pot needed, just fire ash and desperation. During normal times, ash cakes rarely appeared on medieval tables. They were considered emergency food, the kind made only when proper bread wasn't possible. But during the frequent famines that struck medieval Europe, these humble cakes kept countless people alive. What made ash cakes so important was their flexibility when wheat and rye ran out. Any ground grain would work: barley, oats, millet, or even pea flour. When all grain was gone, creative substitutes took their place. Ground acorns dried and ground tree bark, crushed roots, or even ground hay records from the famine of 1315 to 1317 describe desperate peasants making ash cakes from dust swept from the floor of the granary. Literally the dirt and leftover grain bits from empty storehouses. The cooking method itself dated back to ancient times without ovens in their homes. Many peasants already cooked flatbreads on heated stones. Ash cakes took this idea one step further, eliminating even the need for the stone. Medieval writings describe how to brush the worst of the ashes off. Before eating, though gritty teeth were still an occupational hazard of eating this survival food, one surprising advantage of ash cakes was their quick cooking time. Traditional bread required hours of rising, kneading, and baking. Ash cakes could be ready in minutes, a crucial benefit when hunger GW and energy for cooking was limited. Medieval work songs sometimes mention ash cakes as field food made quickly during brief breaks from labor, when workers couldn't return home for meals. The taste about what you'd expect from bread baked in ashes. Smoky, often bitter, and frequently mixed with actual ash. These cakes weren't winning any medieval baking contests. One old joke claimed that ash cakes are the only food that tastes better if you drop them in the mud. First, the mud presumably covering the ashy flavor, despite their unpleasant taste. Ash cakes provided the calories needed to survive during the worst recorded medieval famine. An estimated 15% of Europe's population died of starvation or related illness. Those who survived often did so by eating foods like ash cakes that would normally be considered inedible. A 16th century farming manual includes a grim but practical piece of advice: when grain fails and bread cannot be made in the usual way. The wise peasant remembers the ways of cooking in ash, for it has saved our people since time beyond memory in the harshest times. Even ash cakes might not be possible if ingredients ran too low. That's when medieval peasants turned to true improvisation. The best medieval dish wasn't actually a dish at all. It was simply whatever bits and pieces happened to be around, thrown together in a pot and called dinner. Medieval peasants were masters of kitchen improv centuries before it became trendy to clean out your fridge and make a meal from the random leftovers. This whatever we have approach wasn't just common. It was daily life for most families. Old records from manor kitchens show carefully planned meals with specific ingredients, but peasant cooking rarely followed recipes instead. It followed a simple rule: use what's available, waste nothing, and make it filling enough to work another day. What might a typical whatever we have meal look like in spring? It could be a handful of wild greens tossed with the last winter turnips and a few dried peas. Summer might bring a mix of garden vegetables with a tiny bit of bacon fat for flavor. Fall could mean mushrooms and nuts added to cabbage winter, often meant scraping by with whatever preserved foods remained in storage. The cooking method was equally flexible: got a fire going all day, throw everything in a pot and make soup, need to work in the fields. Until dark, leave ingredients simmering all day in a covered pot, buried in hot ashes, no time to cook at all. Cold leftovers mixed with a chunk of bread would do this. Flexible eating style developed out of necessity, unlike modern times where most people eat 3 separate meals. Daily medieval peasants often ate just once or twice, records from farming. Communities show that during busy seasons like harvest, workers might eat a small morning meal, then a single large meal after the day's work ended. This pattern made the whatever we have approach even more practical one cooking session. Using whatever was available, the mixing of odd ingredients sometimes created surprisingly good results. Several dishes that later became regional specialties started as peasant. Whatever we have meals, the Italian rollita began as reheated leftover bread and vegetables. French ratatouille originated as a summer clean-out-the-garden dish. Many stews, casseroles, and one-pot meals across Europe began as peasant improvisation rather than planned recipes. Medieval tax records give us hints about these mixed meals when paying taxes, and food peasants often delivered oddly specific combinations: three turnips, half a cabbage, and a handful of dried peas, for example. These random groupings likely represented whatever was actually available that day, not planned combinations during holidays and celebrations. Even the whatever we have meals got an upgrade saved. Bits of special ingredients might appear: a precious pinch of salt, a rare spice traded from a passing merchant, or the first fresh vegetables of spring. These small luxuries transformed ordinary mixed meals into feasts by peasant standards. A medieval French saying claimed that the best sauce is hunger, meaning that any food tastes good when you're truly hungry. Peasants living through the hardships of medieval life understood this better than anyone. Their creative approach to cooking with limited resources wasn't just about survival. It was the original farm-table cuisine, shaped by season's necessity and remarkable human adaptability. Human adaptability. Human adaptability. Human adaptability. Human adaptability. Human